A distinguished black man steps into financial bank. He is met with cold stares and hushed whispers. He waits 10 minutes. 30. An hour. Others are served, but not him. When he dares to ask again, a security guard appears to take him out. But just as he turns toward the exit, the glass doors swing open. The board suddenly appears. They've seen everything. And in that moment, the bank's unchecked bias becomes its biggest mistake. Like, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. It was a crisp autumn morning, and the lobby of Grandview Financial Bank buzzed with activity. The polished marble floors reflected the soft glow of the chandelier hanging high above, and the faint hum of conversations blended with the rhythmic tapping of keyboards and the occasional rustle of paperwork. Customers, some impatient, others merely passing time, stood in organized lines, waiting for their turn at the counters where tellers in neatly pressed uniforms processed transactions with swift efficiency. The air carried the faint scent of freshly brewed coffee from a nearby self-service station, where a few suited professionals gathered, checking their phones as they sipped from steaming cups. Through the grand glass doors, Jonathan Reed stepped inside, his presence unassuming yet quietly dignified. He was a tall man in his early 60s, his once powerful frame softened slightly by age, but his posture remained upright, exuding an air of quiet confidence. He wore a simple yet well-maintained dark gray suit, the creases in his trousers crisp, his polished leather shoes tapping softly against the cool floor. In one hand, he held a weathered brown leather briefcase, its edges worn smooth from years of use, and in the other, a sturdy wooden cane, its handle polished from years of his steady grip. His deep brown skin was marked with the lines of time, each wrinkle a story of perseverance, but his eyes, sharp, observant, carried a quiet strength that had not faded. Jonathan moved with measured steps, his cane clicking lightly against the marble with each stride. He had walked into this bank dozens of times over the years, though today felt different. He approached the customer service desk, where a young receptionist, Tyler, sat behind a sleek, minimalist counter. The young man, barely in his mid-20s, was absorbed in his phone, his expression one of mild disinterest. Without looking up, he exhaled sharply, still tapping at his screen. "Yeah, what do you need?" he asked, his tone more suited for dismissing a street vendor than addressing a client at one of the city's most prestigious financial institutions. Jonathan offered a polite but firm smile. "Good morning, young man. I'd like some assistance with my account." Tyler finally looked up, his gaze flicking over Jonathan's attire, his aged briefcase, the cane at his side. Something about Jonathan's presence made him hesitate for half a second before his usual smugness returned. "You sure you have an account here?" he asked, the corners of his mouth twitching with an almost imperceptible smirk. Jonathan's smile didn't falter. "Yes, I'm quite sure. I've been banking here for over 25 years. Tyler arched an eyebrow but didn't press the point. Instead, he motioned toward the waiting area. "You'll have to speak to a teller for that," he said dismissively. "Take a seat. Someone will get to you, eventually." Jonathan inclined his head slightly, not betraying the flicker of irritation that passed through him. He knew this game. He had played it before. But patience was something he had mastered long ago, so he nodded, thanked the young man, and walked over to the seating area. As he lowered himself onto one of the plush but impersonal chairs, he observed the movement around him. The bank was operating smoothly, with customers coming and going. Some were attended to within minutes, their transactions processed quickly and efficiently. He noted how other clients, those in tailored suits or carrying expensive briefcases, were ushered forward with urgency, while others, those who didn't fit the assumed profile of important clientele, were subtly pushed to the back of the line. He waited. 10 minutes, then 20, then 40. Jonathan shifted slightly in his seat, rolling his cane between his fingers. A few times he made eye contact with tellers behind the counter, who glanced at him and quickly looked away. At the 1-hour mark, he watched as a woman who had arrived long after him was called up immediately. She barely had to wait 5 minutes before she was greeted with a beaming smile and attended to. Jonathan sighed. He stood, adjusted his jacket, and made his way to the nearest teller. The woman behind the counter, Emma Carter, was meticulously typing something on her computer. She was in her early 30s, her blonde hair neatly pulled into a sleek ponytail, her sharp features carefully made up. She exuded professionalism, but when she saw Jonathan approaching, her face barely concealed her annoyance. Before he could speak, she sighed. "Sir, I told you, we'll get to you when we can." Jonathan's smile was still there, but this time it was thinner, his patience wearing just slightly. "I understand, Miss Carter. But I've been waiting for over an hour. I'd appreciate it if someone could check on my account now." Emma didn't hide her exasperation. She turned slightly to the man beside her, Brian Foster, a senior associate in his mid-30s with neatly combed hair and an air of quiet arrogance. He leaned in, muttered something under his breath, and Emma responded with a barely suppressed smirk. Jonathan's ears were sharp. Another one of those time wasters. The words were not meant for him, but they were meant about him. Emma finally turned back, her eyes flicking over Jonathan once more, as though sizing him up. "Do you even have the proper documentation?" she asked, her tone dripping with condescension. Jonathan reached into his jacket pocket, retrieving his identification with steady hands, placing it on the counter with quiet precision. "I believe this should suffice." Emma took the ID, squinting at it as though it were somehow illegible. She held it for a long moment before pushing it back across the counter. "Look, sir, we're very busy today. Maybe you should come back when you're more prepared." Jonathan inhaled slowly, keeping his voice even. "I am prepared." Brian, emboldened by Emma's demeanor, leaned in with a scoff. "You know, we've had incidents before," he said, his voice casual but laced with something colder. Jonathan's eyes met his. "I am certain, young man, that I have been banking here since before you started working." Brian didn't like that. His expression hardened. Emma, sensing his agitation, glanced toward the bank's security guard, James Turner, a large man stationed near the entrance. She made a subtle motion, a tilt of her head. James adjusted his belt and strode over, his towering frame casting a shadow over the counter. "Is there a problem here?" Jonathan, unruffled, turned to the guard. "No problem at all," he said evenly. "I am simply trying to access my account." Emma leaned in and whispered something to James. He listened, nodded, then straightened. "Sir, I think it's best if you leave for today," he said, his voice firm, his hand hovering just near his radio. Jonathan's fingers tightened slightly around the handle of his cane. The room had grown noticeably quieter. Other customers had begun to take notice of what was happening. Jonathan's voice remained measured. "Are you asking me to leave without resolving my business here?" Emma folded her arms. "You're holding up the line, sir." A long silence stretched between them. Then, with a slow nod, Jonathan turned on his heel and began walking toward the exit, his cane tapping softly against the marble once more. But just as he neared the doors, something unexpected happened. The glass doors swung open again, and this time it was not another impatient customer stepping inside. It was Richard Holloway, the chairman of the board, followed closely by Olivia Bennett, the bank's chief executive officer, and several other high-ranking members of the board. They had arrived for an unannounced executive audit, and they had witnessed everything. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. The rhythmic clicking of keyboards, the murmured conversations between tellers and clients, even the distant hum of the air conditioning, it all faded into an unnatural stillness as the presence of Richard Holloway, Olivia Bennett, and the rest of the Grandview Financial Bank's executive board filled the space. The weight of their unexpected arrival hung over the lobby like a thundercloud, heavy with unspoken implications. Employees stiffened, customers turned their heads, and even James Turner, the burly security guard, shifted slightly, suddenly unsure of his posture. Jonathan, his step slow and deliberate, paused just before the threshold of the exit. His gaze, steady and unreadable, flickered toward the incoming figures, recognizing Olivia almost immediately. He had met her once, years ago, at a financial symposium when she had only just been promoted to a leadership role. She had seemed sharp then, intelligent, pragmatic. But now, he wondered how much of that idealism had remained intact in a system that often swallowed even the best intentions whole. It was Olivia who reacted first. She was a striking woman in her mid-40s, her dark hair pulled into a sleek chignon, her navy blue power suit impeccable. She scanned the scene quickly, her keen eyes moving from Jonathan to James the security guard, then to the customer service desk where Emma Carter and Brian Foster still stood behind the counter, their faces stiff with barely concealed dread. Olivia's brows knit together in a flash of confusion and then, Within seconds, sharp, simmering displeasure. Richard Holloway, the chairman, a silver-haired man in his late 50s, walked just behind her, his pace slower but his gaze equally assessing. Unlike Olivia, his reaction was more measured, but Jonathan noted the way his lips pressed into a firm line, the subtle tightening of his jaw. He had seen enough boardroom veterans to recognize the look of a man who had just stumbled upon a PR disaster in real time. It was Olivia's voice that finally shattered the silence. What exactly is happening here? Her words weren't shouted, but they carried weight, each syllable crisp with authority. She wasn't asking out of idle curiosity. She was demanding answers. No one spoke immediately. A few tellers exchanged nervous glances. Emma swallowed hard. Brian stiffened. James's grip on his belt tightened. Jonathan remained quiet, allowing the scene to unfold, knowing that patience was sometimes more powerful than immediate protest. After an agonizing pause, James cleared his throat first. "There was an issue with this gentleman's account," he said, his voice measured but slightly unsure. "Staff requested assistance in handling the matter." "Handling the matter," Olivia repeated, her tone ice cold. Her eyes flicked between Emma and Brian. "Is that right?" Her stare lingered on Brian, who, despite his usual arrogant demeanor, suddenly looked less sure of himself. Emma, who had been gripping the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles had turned white, forced a smile that did nothing to mask the beads of sweat forming at her hairline. "Yes, ma'am. The gentleman, Mr. Reed, was unable to provide sufficient account verification. Given recent security concerns, we had no choice but to follow protocol." Jonathan tilted his head slightly, his expression impassive but his silence deliberate. He watched as Olivia's eyes narrowed, taking in Emma's words, dissecting them, picking them apart for the subtext buried beneath the corporate veneer. "Protocol," Olivia echoed slowly, her gaze shifting toward Jonathan now. "Is that true, Mr. Reed? Were you unable to provide verification?" Jonathan met her eyes evenly, his voice steady as he replied. "I provided my ID and relevant documents an hour ago. I was told to wait. And then wait some more. Meanwhile, others were attended to within minutes. When I followed up on my request, I was told I was wasting time. When I asked again, I was told to leave." A murmur rippled through the bank, subtle but undeniable. The tension in the room thickened. Olivia didn't move, didn't blink, but her expression darkened considerably. Emma opened her mouth, perhaps to protest, perhaps to lie, but Richard Holloway cut in sharply before she could speak. "So, let me get this straight," he said, his voice measured but dangerously low. "A long-time client of this bank, an investor, if I recall correctly, was asked to wait for over an hour, denied assistance, humiliated, and then ordered to leave for, what? Asking for basic customer service?" Neither Emma nor Brian had an answer for that. James, to his credit, had at least enough sense to remain silent, realizing his part in this had been a misstep he could no longer justify. Olivia's gaze burned into Brian now. "Mr. Foster, since you seem to be the authority on protocol today, perhaps you can clarify something for me. When did following protocol include singling out a loyal client, refusing to check his account, and treating him as an inconvenience?" Brian's Adam's apple bobbed. "Ma am I." But Olivia wasn't finished. "And tell me, Mr. Foster, is this the same protocol that allows certain clients to bypass waiting entirely while others like Mr. Reed, are ignored?" The color in Brian's face drained completely. Emma, shifting uncomfortably beside him, wasn't faring much better. We were just." "You were just what?" Olivia's voice was deceptively soft. "Just enforcing an unwritten policy of discrimination. Just making assumptions about which clients deserve your time and which ones don't." Silence. Then, finally, Olivia exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Enough. I've heard more than enough." She turned to James. "Stand down. Mr. Reed is not to be escorted anywhere except to an available teller who will process his request immediately." James hesitated only a fraction of a second before nodding. "Yes, ma'am." Jonathan, still composed, gave Olivia a small, respectful nod. "Thank you." Olivia returned the nod but didn't break stride as she pivoted back to Emma and Brian. "As of this moment, your employment with Grandview Financial Bank is terminated." A sharp gasp from Emma. a strangled protest from Brian, the ripple of shocked whispers from employees and customers alike. "Ma'am, wait, please," Emma stammered, her mask of professionalism crumbling. "We didn't mean." "You didn't mean to get caught," Richard corrected, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "And yet here we are." Emma looked around wildly, perhaps hoping for someone to interject, but there was nothing, only the cold, hard reality sinking in. Brian opened his mouth, perhaps to beg, perhaps to justify, but Olivia cut him off. "You will collect your belongings. Security will escort you out. Do not return." Brian's jaw tightened, his face a mask of fury and humiliation, but he knew better than to argue now. With stiff movements he turned, snatching up his things, his eyes burning with the sting of his downfall. Emma, still in shock, followed suit. And just like that, the weight of their arrogance collapsed under the weight of accountability. Jonathan watched as they left, his face unreadable. He had seen men and women like them before, had encountered their ilk countless times, people who wielded power in petty ways, who dismissed people like him without a second thought. But this time there had been consequences. And that, he thought, was something worth remembering. Olivia exhaled, adjusting the cuff of her blazer before looking back at Jonathan. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice measured but sincere, "would you allow me to personally assist you with your account today?" Jonathan considered her for a moment. Then, finally, he nodded. "I'd appreciate that." And for the first time that morning, Jonathan walked toward the teller's desk not as an inconvenience, but as a client finally receiving the respect he deserved. Jonathan followed Olivia through the bank, his measured steps steady, the rhythmic tap of his cane against the polished marble floor punctuating the charged silence that still lingered in the air. Employees cast cautious glances as they passed, some hurriedly returning to their tasks, others too stunned by what had just transpired to pretend they hadn't been watching. The murmurs hadn't stopped entirely, whispers of disbelief, of vindication, of the undeniable shift in the power dynamic that had just taken place. Jonathan, however, remained unfazed, carrying himself with the same quiet dignity he had possessed from the moment he stepped into the bank that morning. Olivia led him toward a private office, one far removed from the open counters and the judgmental gazes of employees who had so easily dismissed him earlier. She pushed the glass door open, motioning for him to step inside. "Please have a seat, Mr. Reed," she said, her voice composed but not devoid of sincerity. Jonathan took his time settling into the high-backed leather chair, setting his worn briefcase down beside him. He adjusted the cuffs of his suit, his fingers steady as he took in the details of the room. Sleek, modern, efficient. It was a space designed for power plays and high-stakes transactions, where decisions were made that affected the bank's future and the lives of those who relied on it. He had sat in many such rooms before, in board meetings and negotiations that shaped industries, yet this moment felt different. Olivia took a seat across from him, folding her hands neatly on the desk. She exhaled, the sharpness that had laced her voice earlier now tempered by something more measured. "Mr. Reed, before we proceed with your account, I need to apologize. What happened out there was unacceptable." Jonathan tilted his head slightly, studying her. He could see the weight of responsibility in her eyes, the realization that this incident, while not unique, had exposed a flaw within the very foundation of her institution. "I've been banking here for over 25 years, he said, his voice even. "I've seen this bank grow, seen leadership change hands, policies shift, buildings expand. But one thing that has remained consistent, it seems, is the assumption of who deserves service and who doesn't." Olivia's fingers twitched slightly against the desk, but she didn't interrupt. Jonathan continued, his tone calm but firm. "The way I was treated today, that wasn't an accident. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a pattern." He let the weight of his words settle before he leaned forward slightly, fixing her with the same level gaze he had given Emma and Brian earlier. "So tell me, Ms. Bennett, what are you going to do about it?" There it was, the challenge, laid bare between them. Olivia didn't look away. She had climbed the ranks of the financial world by being sharp, by being decisive, by recognizing when a problem wasn't just a PR nightmare, but a fundamental issue that needed fixing at its core. And Jonathan Reed had just made it clear that this was no longer a matter of individual misconduct. This was about Grandview Financial Bank's identity, about whether they would continue operating under outdated biases or whether they would truly change. "I don't intend to brush this under the rug," she said finally, her voice carrying a weight of conviction that Jonathan did not miss. "This is more than an isolated incident. It's a systemic failure in how we train, in how we evaluate our employees, in how we define customer service. And I take full responsibility for that." Jonathan regarded her carefully. "Words are easy, Ms. Bennett. Action takes effort." She nodded. "That's why I'm implementing immediate changes." She leaned forward now, matching his directness with her own. "Effective today, every employee, from entry-level tellers to senior management, will undergo mandatory training in bias awareness and customer service ethics. Not just a seminar, not just a checkbox exercise, real, immersive training that will be integrated into our onboarding and ongoing performance evaluations." Jonathan arched an eyebrow. A step in the right direction, he acknowledged, but training only works if the culture changes with it. If those at the top don't model it, don't enforce it, it'll mean nothing. Olivia inclined her head slightly. "That's why I'm restructuring our customer feedback process. No more vague complaint boxes, no more reports that go nowhere. Clients will have a direct line to a review board that will monitor patterns of discrimination or misconduct. Real oversight, real accountability." Jonathan considered this. It wasn't just talk. This was the blueprint of an institution that intended to reform itself from within. But he wasn't done testing her yet. "And what about the people you just fired?" His voice was quiet but pointed. "Emma, Brian, do you believe they were the problem, or just a symptom of something larger?" A flicker of something crossed Olivia's face, not regret, but recognition. They made their choices. They upheld a culture that they benefited from at the expense of clients like you. And for that they had to go. But no, Mr. Reed, they weren't the disease. They were just the carriers. Jonathan's mouth quirked just slightly at that. A sharp mind, this one. "Then I assume you'll be making structural changes as well," he mused. Olivia exhaled, leaning back slightly. "It won't happen overnight," she admitted. "But yes, leadership will be held to the same standards as everyone else. No exceptions." Silence stretched between them for a moment. The kind that wasn't uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken understanding. Then, finally, Jonathan nodded. "All right then. Let's get to work on my account." Olivia allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to cross her lips before she pressed a button on her intercom. "Mia, can you come in, please?" A moment later, the door opened, and Mia Johnson, the junior banker who had watched the entire incident earlier with growing discomfort, stepped in. She looked between Olivia and Jonathan, her posture both professional and slightly nervous. "Yes, ma'am." Olivia gestured toward Jonathan. "Mia, I'd like you to personally assist Mr. Reed with his account today." Mia's eyes flickered with surprise before she quickly masked it with a nod. "Of course." Jonathan stood, retrieving his briefcase with steady hands, before turning to Mia with a small smile. "Let's see if Grandview Financial Bank can live up to its promises." Mia, sensing the weight of this moment, straightened her posture. "We'll make sure of it." As she led Jonathan to her desk, the atmosphere in the bank had shifted. Something had changed, something real. Employees had seen the consequences of discrimination firsthand. Customers had seen accountability in action. And most importantly, Olivia had set a precedent, one that ensured no one would ever be treated the way Jonathan had been treated today again. As Olivia watched them go, she knew this was just the beginning. The real work was only just starting. But for the first time in a long time, she felt certain. This wasn't just about fixing one mistake. This was about rebuilding trust. And trust, she knew, had to be earned. Mia led Jonathan toward a spacious, well-lit cubicle near the back of the bank, her movements brisk but not rushed, her demeanor professional yet tinged with something else, perhaps a quiet determination. She had seen everything unfold that morning, had watched the arrogance of her colleagues collapse under the weight of their own biases, had felt the second-hand embarrassment of their downfall. But more than that, she had felt relief that someone had finally called out what so many had witnessed in silence. She glanced at Jonathan as they reached her desk, taking in the composed way he carried himself, the measured way he placed his worn briefcase on the table and adjusted his cuffs. He hadn't raised his voice once, hadn't let anger dictate his response, and yet his presence alone had commanded change. She found that remarkable. "Mr. Reed, let's start by verifying your information," Mia said, her fingers poised over her keyboard. "I see here that you've been a client with us for 26 years. Jonathan nodded, folding his hands atop the desk. "That sounds about right." Mia frowned slightly as she scrolled through his profile. "It looks like you hold several accounts with us, personal savings, a business account." And she paused, blinking at the screen before looking up at him. "You're also one of our corporate investors?" Jonathan gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. Mia swallowed, suddenly aware of the full weight of what had just transpired. He wasn't just a loyal customer. He was an investor, someone with significant financial ties to the very institution that had humiliated him. The realization sent a fresh wave of unease through her, not for herself, but for the bank as a whole. Jonathan, sensing her shift in demeanor, gave her a knowing look. "It's always interesting," he mused, "how differently people treat you when they realize what you're worth." Mia exhaled through her nose, shaking her head slightly. "That shouldn't have happened, Mr. Reed. None of it." "No, it shouldn't have," Jonathan agreed. "But it did." She held his gaze for a long moment before turning back to the screen, her fingers moving swiftly as she began pulling up the necessary documents. "Let's get this taken care of." For the next 30 minutes, Mia handled Jonathan's requests with the efficiency and professionalism that should have been afforded to him from the start. She updated his account details, ensured that his investment portfolio was in order, and made the necessary adjustments to his business account. She explained every step clearly, pausing to answer his questions, and when she printed out a summary for his review, she took a moment before sliding it across the desk. "I know an apology doesn't fix what happened," she said, her voice quieter now, "but I want you to know that not everyone here operates like that. Some of us," she hesitated, choosing her words carefully, "some of us saw what happened today and knew it was wrong. I should have said something earlier." Jonathan studied her, his sharp gaze searching for something in her expression. He saw guilt, yes, but more importantly, resolve. "You're saying something now," he said simply. Mia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A knock at the glass partition interrupted them. Jonathan turned to see Olivia standing just outside the cubicle, her posture straight, hands clasped in front of her. "Mr. Reed," she said, stepping inside, "I wanted to check in personally. Is everything satisfactory?" Jonathan glanced at Mia before looking back at Olivia. "She's been excellent." Mia felt a flicker of pride at the validation but kept her expression neutral. Olivia nodded. "I'm glad to hear that." Then, without missing a beat, she added, "There's something else I'd like to discuss with you, if you have a moment." Jonathan lifted an eyebrow. "Of course." Olivia turned to Mia. "Would you excuse us?" Mia stood immediately. "Of course, Ma, I am." She collected her things, giving Jonathan a brief but respectful nod before stepping away. Once she was gone, Olivia took the seat she had vacated, folding her hands on the desk as she studied Jonathan for a moment before speaking. "I meant what I said earlier about making changes. But I also know that institutional reform can't happen in a vacuum. It requires insight, accountability, and perspective from those who have experienced the flaws firsthand." Jonathan listened, his expression unreadable. "I'd like to invite you to be a part of that process," Olivia continued. "Not as a client, not as an investor, but as an advisor, someone who can help shape the policies we implement moving forward." That caught Jonathan off guard. He leaned back slightly, considering her. "You want me to consult for the bank?" "I want you to help ensure that no one is treated the way you were today," Olivia clarified. "We can't erase what happened, but we can prevent it from happening again. And I believe your insight would be invaluable in doing that." Jonathan was silent for a long moment. This wasn't the outcome he had anticipated when he walked into Grandview Financial Bank that morning. He had come in expecting a simple transaction, had been met with dismissal, and had walked straight into a battle he hadn't asked for but had fought nonetheless. And now he was being asked to help fix the very system that had wronged him. He tapped his fingers against the desk thoughtfully. "Ms. Bennett," he said finally, his voice measured, "if I say yes to this, understand that I'm not here to make people comfortable." Olivia gave a small smile, though there was nothing amused about it. I wouldn't expect anything less. Jonathan studied her for another moment before nodding. Then let's get to work. The weight of his words settled over them, solid, unshakable, the foundation of something new. And just like that, the first step toward real change had been taken. The weeks following Jonathan's decision to step into an advisory role at Grandview Financial Bank were a whirlwind of transformation, resistance, and reckoning. Change, Jonathan knew, was never immediate, never simple. Institutions, especially ones built on old money, old hierarchies, and old habits, did not shift overnight. But they could be forced to move. Jonathan's presence in the executive meetings was met with mixed reactions. Some board members saw his involvement as a necessary correction, a long overdue acknowledgement of systemic failures within the bank's culture. Others viewed him as a disruptor, an outsider brought in to appease a scandal, a man who did not belong in their circle. He saw it in their eyes, in the subtle tightness of their jaws, in the way they avoided looking at him too long. And yet, none of them could deny him. His name carried weight. His investments, his history with the institution, his very presence, was a reminder that they had failed. Olivia, true to her word, did not simply give him a seat at the table for show. She listened. She challenged her team, forced accountability where it had long been absent, and dismantled the complacency that had allowed discrimination to fester unchecked. The first initiative implemented under Jonathan's advisement was a complete overhaul of customer service training. Employees were no longer judged solely on efficiency, but on equity in service, on their ability to recognize and correct biases in real time. Each department, from tellers to senior executives, underwent immersive workshops designed not just to educate but to force reflection, to expose the invisible prejudices that had shaped interactions for years. Mia was promoted. Jonathan had watched her closely in the weeks following his first encounter with her, had noted the way she absorbed knowledge, adapted quickly, and carried a sense of responsibility that others lacked. When Olivia suggested she oversee the new Diversity Inclusion Task Force, Jonathan had only nodded in approval. She had earned that role. Meanwhile, not everyone embraced the shift. There were resignations, people unwilling to unlearn their biases, unwilling to accept that the world was changing around them. Jonathan did not mourn their departures. A house could not be rebuilt without removing its rotting beams. And then there were the customers. At first, the changes were met with confusion, with pushback from certain longtime clients who bristled at the notion that they, too, might be held to a higher standard of conduct. "People like me are the backbone of this bank," one wealthy investor had scoffed during a private client meeting, barely disguising his disdain. "We don't need to be lectured about political correctness." Jonathan had only smiled, calm, unshaken. "People like you," he had said, "voice even, are exactly why this change is necessary." The investor had left in a huff. The bank had survived without him. But others had stayed. More importantly, others had come. Customers who had once felt invisible at Grandview, who had once been treated as second-class clients, returned. The bank, for the first time in its history, felt open, felt different. Jonathan saw the shift in the way tellers greeted every customer the same way now, without hesitation or judgment. He saw it in the way security guards were no longer called at the slightest inconvenience. He saw it in the way people looked at him now, not as an exception, not as an anomaly, but as a valued member of the institution. One afternoon, months after that first fateful day, Jonathan entered Grandview again. This time, there were no lingering glances, no hesitant whispers. The tellers greeted him by name. The security guard, not James, he had been replaced by someone better suited for the role, gave him a respectful nod. At the center of the lobby, a new plaque had been installed. It read, "The Reed Initiative for Equitable Banking, a commitment to fair and inclusive service for all clients." Jonathan paused, reading the inscription carefully, his fingers brushing over the engraved letters. He had not asked for this. He had not demanded recognition. But Olivia had insisted. "This bank," she had told him, "owes you more than an apology." Jonathan stepped back, taking in the sight. The name, his name, was not just a symbol of what had happened, but a reminder of what had been corrected, of what could never be allowed to happen again. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Reed." He turned. "Mia, She was standing at the customer service desk, now promoted to a managerial role, her expression warm but professional. "Would you like to check on your accounts?" she asked. Jonathan smiled, small but genuine. "No rush," he said. "I know I'll be taken care of." And for the first time in a long time, he meant it. Grandview Financial Bank had changed. For good. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.